So we can go ahead and get started. My name's Sebastian Guali. I'm a third-year resident at Children's Hospital Los Angeles. And I've had the pleasure of working with Dr. Harlow and Dr. Cruz and adjacently to Jean Reisz, who's here with us today. And so I appreciate everyone coming to be able to learn about kind of our immigrant health group and this webinar dedicated to immigrant health, migrating towards resilience models of care for the newcomer child. And so welcome, Daniel. Thank you for joining us. Yeah, hey, Jean. And so for our presentation, we kind of have three different speakers who bring three different expertise. Topic of the newcomer children and their overall health and well-being, especially prominent here in Los Angeles. And so I'm going to pass off the microphone to the speaker, starting with Dr. Harlow, to introduce themselves and be able to get this presentation going. Throughout the presentation, if you have questions, we can drop them into the chat, and then we'll try to get to them at the end of the presentation after the three speakers have gone. So thanks everyone for being here and dedicating this hour with us.
Okay, thank you, Sebastian. I know a lot of you guys already, but I'm Dr. Harlow, John Harlow. So I am a pediatrician at Children's Hospital Los Angeles. Work within the FQHC system at Altamed, and I'm the co-founder and the medical director for this project La Linterna. So the three of us, Natalie and Jean and I, all work together on this project. So I'm going to first, you guys can all see my screen here? Yeah, am I in presentation mode or you guys see all the slides?
We see all the slides.
I believe we see all the slides right now.
Okay, let's make sure I can actually do this properly. Where is that? Hold on, sorry guys. There we go. Okay. So I'm going to try to go through my slides relatively quick so my partners here can have adequate time. But the first thing I wanted to do is just kind of set a little bit of background. You know, as many of you guys are familiar with to some degree, we practice medicine, all of us, at a time of really immense change demographically and in other ways, both in global patterns of migration, but then also at more locally at the southwest border here, the border between the United States and Mexico. So if you go back 10, 12 years ago, really you see a dramatically different picture in terms of who's migrating worldwide and then here is seeking admittance into the United States. So this first graphic on the left here kind of demonstrates that worldwide. So in terms of the number of stateless people, refugees, asylum seekers, if you go back about 10 or 12 years, you see that number around 40 million. By 2021, that's almost 90 million people. So it's more than doubled. In 2022, that number exceeded 100 million people. So 100 million stateless people or displaced people worldwide. And then that number has just continued to grow. So it's really an enormous amount of people worldwide, larger than the population of France and Germany combined. Just a really, really immensely large group of folks. And in this right graphic here, you see, unfortunately, for a whole host of reasons, children are disproportionately represented within that group. Now, while that's the case worldwide, at the southwest border, there's been many changes also over that same decade or so. Of course, the number of foreign-born individuals in the United States is very large at this time, as it has been throughout U.S. history, really. But in recent years, we're approaching the high watermark for foreign-born individuals as a percentage of people living in the United States. A mark that is sort of associated with that time period at the turn of the last century, sort of 1890, 1900, 1910, when you had about 15, 16 to 17% of total people in the United States being born in a different country of origin. And we're approaching that mark here again today. So immigration, of course, as everyone knows, is a major part of the fabric of our society. But really, who is coming to the United States, who is seeking admittance into the United States through the southwest border has changed dramatically over that same period of time while the numbers have been going up. So the first big change is decrease in what you would term as single adults traveling by themselves. So if you go back 10 or 12 years ago, the median person, the typical person arriving at the southwest border seeking admittance into the United States is a single adult male whose country of origin primarily is Mexico. And statistically is most likely to be trying to enter the United States for the reason of participating in the economy, either short term, medium term, or long term. Over this past decade, that's dramatically shifted. So we see a overall increase in women and children who are traveling as parts of family units or by themselves over that period of time. So today, that median individual is no longer a single adult male. And also the country of origin has changed dramatically. So you go from overwhelmingly folks coming from Mexico as the country of origin to a whole other host of countries. You know, when we started this project a little more than 5 years ago, really who we primarily saw in clinic, other than individuals coming from Mexico, were folks coming from what's termed the Northern Triangle, so El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras. That was a huge increase over the period from about 2012 to 2018. Now we see other dramatic shifts that are kind of superimposed on that previous shift. So on the right there, major increases of individuals coming from Ecuador, Brazil, Nicaragua, Venezuela, other countries as well that aren't on here. You know, we see folks coming from Costa Rica, coming from Ukraine, from Afghanistan, Brazil, many countries throughout South America, but then also in the Middle East and Eastern Europe as well. And then, of course, one of the more dramatic shifts that people are aware of from reports in the media is the emergence of this category of the unaccompanied child designation. So that's a bureaucratic designation that a child is just going to receive because of an encounter with ICE or with Customs and Border Patrol. And it means exactly kind of what you would think. So if you cross the border without documentation, if you're under the age of 18 at that time and you're not traveling with an accompanying adult, then when you encounter ICE, you receive that designation. And that was a category of migrant that was extremely rare prior to 2011, 2012. Then you see a dramatic increase in the number of kids that are receiving that designation for multiple reasons. I mean, because they are indeed traveling by themselves, they're physically crossing the border by themselves. And then also we know there's some individuals who receive that designation because even though they crossed the border with an accompanying adult, they were forcibly separated from that adult immediately upon encounter with ICE. That adult was then put into deportation proceedings and the child was processed as an unaccompanied child. But either way, it's a really dramatic shift from a place, 10 years ago when we were talking about only kind of a handful of kids every year to now we have thousands and tens of thousands of kids every year who receive that designation. So from media reports, I think people have a picture of what happens to kids when they go into custody as an unaccompanied child. Conditions have varied widely, and amounts of time that kids have been in this state of incarceration has varied quite a bit too. Nowadays, in this current administration, they really try to process kids pretty rapidly within the first 2 to 3 weeks. They try to process them through so that they're no longer in the custody of ICE or ORR more commonly now. But in the past, and we've seen in our clinic many kids who've been in that state of custody for weeks and months, and even I think probably we have a kid or two was there for more than a year in custody. So what happens during that time? The government undertakes an attempt to find what's called a sponsoring family member. So that individual does not have to be a citizen of the United States. They just have to be somebody who physically resides in the United States, can demonstrate a relationship to that child, is over 18, and then can pass a background check. Now, once that sponsor is identified, the government then generally tries to rapidly reunite that child, that unaccompanied minor, with the sponsor. In no way does that mean that their immigration case is finished. Their immigration case is going to continue to be adjudicated, but they go to live with the sponsor in the community where the sponsor lives in the United States. As you see on this graphic right here, and as you would imagine, where we practice medicine, Southern California, specifically Los Angeles County, is very much a place where many of these UCs go to stay with the sponsor. The dark blue states there, us in Texas, and then also New York and Florida, those are places where a lot of UCs have been placed with sponsors. And then specifically Harris County in Texas, where Houston is, and Los Angeles County, always year over year, these are number one and number two in terms of number of UCs placed with a sponsor. So these kids are very much a part of our community. You know, on this graphic here, I try to show, and this is just over the course of one quarter of a fiscal year. You see that the amount of kids that have been UCs that have been placed in California at large, and then in Los Angeles County specifically. And on that lower bar there, I arranged them in descending order, so you can see Alameda County is the number 2, and LA County really dwarfs Alameda in terms of placement of unaccompanied children. And then some of our other surrounding counties, Orange County, Riverside, also with not insignificant numbers of kids who've been placed with sponsors, kids who've had this experience. So they're a part of our community. They're part of our pediatric patient population, absolutely. In Los Angeles County, there's, you know, it's very hard to say specifically because this population is highly mobile. But there's somewhere on the order of thousands to tens of thousands of kids with this exact experience as a UC, this experience of incarceration, living in LA County. And then there's many, many more who have analogous experiences. So Dr. Cruz is going to speak a little bit to the history that some of these kids experience. But there are many kids who may not even have that UC designation, but have an analogous pattern of exposure to adversity. So I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Cruz then, and she'll kind of take us the rest of the way here.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Harlow. Hi, everyone. I am Dr. Natalie Cruz. I am a clinical psychologist at Children's Hospital and the mental health director for La Linterna. So I will be sharing a little bit more about the mental health of a lot of the kids that we see within our clinic. And I think the best way to do this is really to take everyone on what I like to think about a little bit of a journey. It's one thing to sort of look at those numbers, and another thing to really think and feel and connect with what the journey can be for so many of our most vulnerable unaccompanied minors that we see. So we'll start with pre-migration. Why are we seeing so many youth migrating through and coming into the US? I think this is really an excellent graph that really highlights that the need for escaping the crimes in the region and for really significant safety concerns has really overtaken that search for opportunity and that drive for migration. So on the left side here, we start with societal reasons. There's been a significant increase in gang violence and sort of that northern triangle area that Dr. Harlow was talking about, that's increased into Mexico and many other parts of South America. And so a common story that we often hear is, you know, I never had plans to come to the US, but we started to get extorted for money in our small business, and those extortions grew to the point where we weren't able to pay. Drug cartels that were claiming that area, and so our family became threatened, and the threats became more and more serious. And that's sort of what, you know, broke the camel's back and drove the migration. So really thinking about societal reasons, of course, you know, limited education, employment opportunities, reasons of being socially excluded and not really being free to practice, to be who they are. And then we move into family reasons. So we also find sometimes unaccompanied minors migrating as a way to escape potentially domestic violence that's occurring in the home, or different forms of child abuse. They're trying to get away from the perpetrator. That's driving migration. I think it's important to think about historical reasons that impact each and every country. Each and every country has their own story of civil war, of chronic poverty, of survival. So keeping that in mind, I think, is essential. And then we come to the right side here that encompasses, I think, the underlying piece to all of this is that the governments are having a hard time really protecting its citizens from all of this collective trauma that's impacting youth. There really isn't a trust, in going to the police because a lot of times there's corruption and it can make things worse. And so families make the decision or youth make the trek on their own to cross into the US. And yes, during migration. So I always say minors are usually very aware of the numerous dangers that they can face en route to the US, yet they get to a point where they feel like those risks are lesser than the risks in their home country. If I stay in my home country, it's just really bad. But if I take this journey, I might have the hope of coming out on the other side. But the journey is quite extraneous, so it can involve, especially, of course, again, thinking about our unaccompanied minors who are coming in undocumented. Their journey can involve human trafficking, forced labor, as they're entrusting these so-called coyotes to help them navigate and know sort of which paths to take as they're crossing through multiple borders. Sometimes youth get taken advantage of in many different ways, physical or sexual abuse. They may experience harassment by local authorities and detention by even maybe the Mexican government or other government agencies as they're coming along the way. I like to think about vicarious trauma. For youth, it's especially important to think about trauma being not just something that happens directly to them, but a traumatic event could be seeing a loved one experience a really significant act of violence or abuse. And so youth, a lot of times also may experience vicarious trauma or separation or loss of family members, as Dr. Harlow mentioned. Sometimes they might be separated at the border, sometimes they're separated out even earlier in their path as they come up to the US. And in general, just a very harsh, life-threatening travel conditions that can include malnutrition, not really knowing when your next meal is going to be. It can include injuries, infections, right? We're just kind of trying to get away from this pandemic, but not really. And, at its peak, there really wasn't, social distancing, masks for these youth that were taking this journey. And just long distances by foot that they're needing to walk, and hazardous train rides. I'm not sure if people have heard of La Bestia. If we had more time, I'd show a little 3-minute video clip, but it's essentially a freight train that comes from the southern tip point of Mexico and goes all the way up to the northern tip. And a lot of youth and their families will jump on top of the freight trains, as you see here in the picture, as a way to travel from point A to point B. But it is very dangerous, it's very hot, you're going through different desert, just different elements, and it exposes them to many, different health issues as well. And next slide, please. Thank you. Crossing into the US. So if they're able to get to the point where they cross into the US, I think there's a few different things that can happen. Some minors, cross paroled as refugees or asylees under specifically government-defined criteria. A lot of refugees from Afghanistan, for example, might have already that designation to them, or the Ukraine. But there's other minors who cross to the US on foot, who maybe go undetected by US Customs and Border Protection. And then there's the third group, which is the vast majority of the clients that we see in our clinic, which is youth that maybe were detained and separated from their adult traveling companion and placed into these detention centers, often referred to as hieleras, because they're very cold and they're very regulated. You know, even if you're coming in with sort of maybe multiple sweaters, you can only go in with like one shirt or one sweater. They're very regimented and definitely not a kid-friendly place. You know, they're given these aluminum sort of blankets to keep warm, but they're known to be really cold and just uncomfortable. Again, not kid-friendly. By law, kids are not supposed to be here for more than 72 hours, but there's been times in our history where, you know, and even till today that, you know, that rule might not be kept as well as it should be. But from there, they usually go into a refugee center. Those places do have some more, you know, child-friendly supports in place. They might have some kind of schooling or teaching that happens. They may be connected to a mental health counselor or have extracurricular activities and things. And that's where Dr. Harlow was mentioning that they stay for, could be months before they're connected to a sponsor that will be continuing to care for them. All right, post-migration, you know, once youth, you know, have taken this long trek here and they're connected to someone and they're connected to a home, you know, then they again sort of are met often with another challenge, which is that you know, their idealistic expectations are not exactly what they're facing in reality as they're settling in. They might be coming into a neighborhood where there's high rates of violence or even exposure to the same gangs that they were trying to get away from. Rent, you know, needless to say, is very expensive in the LA area in particular, but across the US. And so a lot of families are moving in, you know, there might be a 1-bedroom apartment that's shared with 3 other families with multiple kids, very limited resources and really uncomfortable and substandard living conditions. As youth enter school, you know, the academic stressors are really high. A lot of times youth may not be English speaking, they might not be Spanish speaking. We certainly work with a lot of youth whose primary language is an indigenous dialect. And so being placed in different, you know, giant high schools with lots of kids and lots of things moving really quickly is just quite a challenge. LAUSD doesn't have the best, you know, support systems for bilingual kids. And it's a real struggle. Racial profiling, discrimination, a culture of stress, you know, migratory grief is a really interesting concept, but really thinking about that loss that's felt in coming to a new place, not just the loss of sort of disconnecting from family and loved ones, pets, you know, in the eyes of kids. Those things are really important and valuable, but really, you know, experiencing the loss of your culture, your land, your customs, your local, you know, stores, your rituals, your traditions, everything changes for youth, and there's this experience of grief that's intangible, but it's felt quite strongly by many. There can be changes of you know, roles, economic, social status, even family structure as youth are coming in, concerns for family and friends in home countries, and of course the ongoing legal proceedings with persistent fears of detention and deportation, and just the uncertainty about their future, not really knowing what's going to happen. So all of this to say is certainly many migrant youth experience a high level of adverse childhood experiences. I think we all know that the higher the number of ACEs we have in our early years, the increased likelihood that we have poor outcomes, health risk behaviors, and at least in one study, but I think there's been many studies with kind of similar findings, we do see that refugee minors can experience a high level of symptoms of anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, and suicidal ideation. So these symptoms go up dramatically compared to other non-immigrant youth and families. And again, I think it's a direct relationship to just kind of constantly being in this state of survival as you're navigating these different points in your life. I like to say vulnerable but resilient. It's also a title of a book that I highly recommend in case any of you are really interested in understanding more the experience of this community. So despite the high levels of adversity, many migrant children do demonstrate incredible resilience. A very recent study looked at this population specifically, and 4 main themes came out of the study as what I like to think about being protective factors that might, reduce the possibility and outcome of having those significant mental health issues. So individual factors, having inherent pro-social behaviors, problem-solving skills, kind of being able to rapidly and flexibly think about solutions to different problems. Lifetime relationships, I think this is really important and a really interesting finding. So having strong connections, strong ties both with your country of origin and also strong new ties that you begin to form within your new country. So that connection, and I think research shows that across many different situations that perceived social support is one of the biggest buffers to stress and trauma. So lifetime relationships, right? Securing, maintaining, nourishing the ones from your home country. And thankfully, we now have social media. This is one of the positive things about social media, to be able to maintain those relationships, but also opening, youth that open up their hearts and begin to connect and form relationships with new people here. Acculturation, finding a way to integrate your own culture with the new culture, learning to enjoy different foods, different customs, and finding a way to kind of thread those two together. It's quite an art form, but when youth are able to really begin to do that and hold pride in who they are, and also, hold pride for the new things and experiences they're having in their new country. Those things serve as a buffer to those mental health issues. Positive relationships with pro-social institutions, right? Systems, beginning to form and trust, helpers within the community and building those relationships. And finally, care arrangements. So ideally having supported but less restrictive living arrangements, right? So youth who maybe end up in group homes or more restricted living conditions can fare worse than youth that are able to join maybe a supportive, aunt or grandmother, or even, reunifying with other family members that they hadn't seen in a long time, but that it becomes a really supportive home environment. That's ideal. So those are, some of those protective factors here. And as we continue to migrate towards resilience, I'd like to talk a little bit about the type of mental health screening that we do in our clinic that Dr. Harlow will talk more about. But really what we do is we start with conducting a brief psychosocial interview, right? Clinical interview. We're building rapport, we're establishing that connection and getting to know youth a lot more. The HEADS, I know, is a popular assessment tool that can be used to gather that information quickly and quite comprehensively. We assess for adverse childhood experiences, really asking the questions. And in clinic, we have the luxury of having a little bit more time. And so our mental health team is able to go through, the adverse childhood experience measures in person to really get kind of the most honest responses that we can to really understand some of the things that kids have gone through. Ask about migration. I think there's a lot of hesitancy sometimes around asking how to ask, and of course you want to do it with respect and with genuine curiosity for the health and well-being of the child. But there's a few sample questions of things I might ask during our screening. Validate feelings, right? Provide psychoeducation around the impact of trauma. A lot of times youth might not see the connection, right? If we've ruled out any kind of medical etiology for stomach aches, headaches, or other things, other, stress or trauma related complaints, really helping to begin to provide that psychoeducation of how stress and trauma can be impacting their well-being. And exploring factors of resilience. I think, if we're asking about adversity, we need to also ask about resilience. Who is in your support network? What coping skills have helped you to get to where you are today? What are some of your strengths, interests, and hopes for the future? At the end of it, what we really want is kids to just be kids, right? Teens to just be teens and have that developmentally appropriate arch to their development and thriving and being well. And so, fostering those areas of strengths and interest goes a long way. And addressing mental health needs, right? Of course, if we are meeting with youth where we are suspecting depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress, or other mental health conditions, we want to definitely link kids to mental health services with a trauma-informed, culturally sensitive provider that can provide evidence-based treatment. And there's a few models that I think are sort of gold standard for addressing trauma specifically for really young children, 0 to 5. We have child-parent psychotherapy, which is really a dyadic model that helps youth understand sort of the different challenges and stressors that they've had in their life, with a caregiver in the room as well. We have trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy where we teach youth different skills, relaxation strategies, cognitive coping skills, and then have them sort of share the story of their life, kind of go through it and challenge any maladaptive thoughts that they have that we think about really being the ones that are maintaining the symptoms that may be impacting them. And then narrative therapy in general, I think, has been found to be very helpful with this community. Exploring case management needs as well. I think about a lot of the families that we work with where, food insecurity, housing issues, so many other needs are really overbearing, the even mere thought of, having this, being connected to mental health treatment. And so you sort of need this combined effort, this combined energy to help really address mental health needs. So connecting with community-based organizations, partnering with others within your program to really address those case management needs that will, further help you thrive and be well. And I always like to add, think about how you can incorporate social justice principles into your service. Sometimes letters of support that can break the barriers to youth being able to thrive in the community, those go a long way. And with that thought, I will hand it off to my colleague, Ms. Jean Reisz, who will share more from the legal side of things.
Thank you, Dr. Cruz. Thank you for having me. I am a professor of law at the USC Law School, and I also co-direct the USC Immigration Clinic. And so I thought I would just give you an idea of kind of the legal world that some of these children are navigating, in addition to all the other things that Dr. Cruz has spoken about. So you could go to the next slide. I think one of the things that is also harmful and part of the immigration story are these kind of narratives about families risking their children, taking these horrible trips and journeys, or having people cross the border and the bad immigrant versus the good immigrant. And so that is also, I think, something that's just weighing on a lot of children, is this narrative about the choices their parents made. So I like starting off with that quote because I think it really resonates with why so many people are fleeing. Go to the next one. So this is just kind of a snapshot of immigration court cases. Under President Obama, we had what was called the rocket docket. And the priority for removal were unaccompanied minors. There's actually a statutory term in the Immigration and Nationality Act, unaccompanied alien child, UAC. And so that was kind of that designation that Dr. Harlow is referring to. And so we had this push to deport them as fast as possible when we had these kind of spikes for starting. You can go to the next one. Just to give you an idea too about the immigration court backlog, we have people there who, our immigration court backlogs at about 2 million now. And so the immigration court and immigration judges, they are employees of the Attorney General. So they're not independent Article I federal judges. They serve at the pleasure of the Attorney General, who is enforcing a particular immigration policy or immigration agenda of the president. And so this is part of the problem, is they're under-resourced, and the backlog is because whoever's the priority, those are the cases that are being heard. We have cases in our clinic that have been around for 10 years, 7 years. I have one that I'm going up to San Francisco for next week that has been around for 5 years. And I think the government shutdown is going to happen, and we'll probably get that case is going to be pushed out even further. But this is another thing of just kind of this state of uncertainty and having to go to court, but also spending so many years in the US waiting for the ultimate resolution of your case as you're going to school and making friends and still having, a government that's actively having you in proceedings. And then this is just gives a snapshot of the average wait time. Is it about, almost 800 days? And if, and this is just in removal proceedings, this isn't taking into account the different appellate levels one can take if they lose an immigration court. So to also give you a snapshot of kind of the deportation mill that is immigration court, the Assistant Chief Immigration Judge, Judge Jack Will, this is an actual quote. People in removal proceedings, deportation proceedings, they are not entitled to attorneys at government expense. So if someone can afford an attorney to represent them, they can have an attorney, but they are not provided attorneys, and that includes children. And so you have an actual chief immigration judge saying that he's taught immigration law to 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds. I tell my students all the time that 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds could get it. So, everyone should be getting A's in law school. But this is pretty, I think, shocking. And this is something that he said, like, in the media. It wasn't something that was overheard and leaked. So this is an issue with having unaccompanied minors who represent themselves. This used to be my youngest client, which was 5 years old. Our new youngest client, I think, is 2. But he was drawing this on legal paper while he was sitting at me at counsel table and being asked, what country he wanted to be removed to. So the common forms of immigration relief that we're going to see for some of these children and their families are asylum, withholding of removal, which is an asylum-like form of protection under the Convention Against Torture. These are kind of humanitarian forms of immigration relief. U visa is the crime victim visa, where if one is a victim of a particular qualifying crime, usually a serious felony, and they cooperate with law enforcement, that could be, and they suffered substantial emotional or physical harm, that could be a way to get a visa and a pathway to citizenship. T visa, if one has been trafficked into the US or they have remained in the US because of being trafficked, that could also be a potential form of relief. Special immigrant juvenile status is for children under the age of, unmarried children under the age of 21, who a state court judge has to make a finding that due to abandonment, abuse, or neglect, that a child should remain in the US and that it's not in their best interest to return home. And I'll talk more about these a little bit. I've just as kind of a snapshot. Humanitarian parole is kind of temporary permission to be in the US. It could be granted for 6 months to 2 years. This is how there's a parole program right now for Ukrainians, Afghans, Venezuelans, Cubans, and Nicaraguans. But the way it's being handled by the Biden administration is it has to be applied for outside of the US, not at the border. And one has to obtain those travel documents before coming to the US. So it's not available to those who were approaching the border through the southern border through Mexico and not kind of flying in with previous authorization. But it can be granted to people at the border. And one thing I will kind of note is people arriving at the border who don't have a visa are subject to mandatory detention. And so in theory, the government authorizes everyone to be detained without a determination of whether they pose a danger to the community or a risk of flight. Humanitarian parole is what's being used at the border to release certain people, certain families, children, so that they're not in detention facilities. Because that is what the law kind of requires, but humanitarian parole gives an out for that. And then prosecutorial discretion is just the government saying, you're here unlawfully, we can remove you, but we're not going to, we're just gonna let you stay. And so that is being offered right now for people if they've got humanitarian issues, if they don't have a criminal history, previous immigration history. I won't go into all of the weeds here. This is a couple of Tanzanian children that we represented who received asylum. They were persecuted on account of having albinism in Tanzania. And one of the things with asylum is it is a pathway to citizenship. It can lead to permanent residence and then citizenship. It has to be applied for within a year of arrival. And you have to prove that you've been persecuted or will be persecuted, which is a type of severe harm, on account of a protected ground. And as you can see, the protected grounds are race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. And an example of that would be like gay men in Uganda, for example, would be a particular social group. So what we're seeing, people fleeing climate events, people fleeing more kind of organized crime, cartels, gangs, they're going to have a harder time being eligible for asylum, because even if they can establish the persecution, they have to show that it was because of one of these reasons. And also they have to show it's by the government or someone the government's unable or unwilling to control. And that's all up to an immigration judge or an asylum officer to kind of interpret how they want, these terms. But there are, and then another thing that is an issue for children who are eligible for asylum is it doesn't provide any status to their family. So a child may receive asylum, but their parent or family members can be deported because they don't get derivative status. Now, if their parents receive asylum, children can get derivative status through their parents. Convention Against Torture is just, you have to show that you're going to be tortured by the government or with its acquiescence. So again, some of the people who are fleeing just kind of climate disasters or criminal organizations, they are going to have a harder time being eligible for this relief. U visa and T visas are available, but the crime has to be committed in the US. For a U visa, it's usually a serious felony. And so it also can be a bystander. So if a child is a victim of a crime, they could be eligible, but their parents could if their parents cooperated with law enforcement. But that happens if you're already in the US. It doesn't count for crimes committed outside. And then a T visa, one of the kind of problems with a T visa is your trafficking has to be tied to the reason that you're in the US. So if someone escapes a trafficking situation and has remained in the US for a long period of time, it's a little bit harder to get. You would have to prove that there was like these exceptional circumstances, which is why you couldn't leave. Special immigrant juvenile status is a common form of relief for an unaccompanied minor, because there has to be an unaccompanied minor who, even if they have one parent with them, they can have to show that the other parent, because of neglect, abandonment, or abuse, they can't be reunited. So oftentimes we see children, we have to have children in probate court or family court seeking guardianships or custody by another individual. And the state court has to make a finding that they can't be reunited with one or both parents, and removal to the country is not in the child's best interest. With that order, they can then apply to the Department of Homeland Security for what's called a special immigrant juvenile status, which is a special visa that leads to permanent resident and citizenship. One of the problems with this form of relief is it's really dependent on a state judge making that order. So in California, fortunately in Los Angeles County, a lot of state court judges are familiar with these procedures and will not be difficult. But in some of the other states where there might be more anti-immigrant sentiments or just inexperience with the special immigrant juvenile status, you have to educate the judges. It's harder to get that predicate order, and that's necessary. So some of the things that we often use in our firm when we're working with doctors, and what Dr. Cruz and Dr. Harlow have been instrumental in doing for our clients, is writing letters that we can use in many different ways. One is for humanitarian parole. So what's the diagnosis? What's the treatment, the prognosis? An example is we had a client whose child was, or we had a client that was the child, and we were also representing the mother, and she missed her court hearing because her child was having renal failure and had to get dialysis several times during the week. And she just didn't go to immigration court. And so she was ordered deported. The whole family was ordered deported because they didn't show up. We were able to reopen the proceedings by proving that there were these exceptional circumstances why she didn't show up. We had another US citizen child whose parents were outside of Mexico, not eligible for visas. One had previously been deported, and he had, end-stage brain cancer. And we were able to get their parents' humanitarian parole to come and spend a few months with their son in California, and they would not have been eligible otherwise. And we wouldn't have been able to do that without declarations from Dr. Harlow regarding that. Also forensic reports. So if we have, asylum cases where someone's referring to persecution, cigarette burns, broken bones, something like that, sometimes forensic reports corroborate their story, saying this is consistent. Mental health expert declarations regarding PTSD, being consistent with what happened with that might help show the persecution or the torture, or for some sort of parole or prosecutorial discretion that this person has really experienced trauma. But there's different ways that we've used that. And then also, not even as evidence in cases of children in deportation proceedings, but just helping children to get to court, or helping their family members talk about what happened, will help us do our job. So being healthy mentally and physically gives our clients the ability to participate in their defense and be able to go through this kind of prolonged, horrible deportation proceedings. So that's, I just included this as an example of a mental health expert that we had write about a 10-year-old child. We were able to get asylum for this 10-year-old unaccompanied minor because we were proving the past persecution through the declaration of the expert. And this is the 5-year-old client that is now a citizen because he was able to get asylum, and that's him with his citizenship. Humanitarian parole, I already talked about, just being this very discretionary permission for people to come in the US and remain on a temporary basis while they perhaps have a humanitarian issue, or they can then seek asylum or be in the US and not be in detention. And then this is a letter Dr. Harlow wrote for that child that we talked about who had brain cancer, to talk about the kind of humanitarian need for his parents to be paroled into the U.S. to be with him. And that's Alfredo and his mom. So they were able to be together. And so that's all for me.
Okay, so I'll just very briefly touch on the model that we all work on here because we're almost out of time. But so the three of us and a whole group of other amazing practitioners who are not here tonight work together on this project that's called La Linterna. So we're an interdisciplinary co-located clinic providing holistic and trauma-informed care for immigrant refugee children and families. So there's 4 pieces that makes us interdisciplinary, right? The first is medical. Primary care through the Ultimate system with subspecialty referral into CHLA. The second piece is the mental health care piece. So Natalie touched on that quite a bit. The third piece is legal. So immigration legal counsel, every family that's referred into our program, spends an hour with one of our attorneys and kind of talks over the whole situation and tries to find some avenue of relief for the family if it's there. And then many of the families go on to be represented by our attorneys too throughout the adjudication of their case. And then the fourth piece is kind of case management. We're co-located, and the fact that we do that all together in one place on one day. So when families get referred in or kids get referred into the program, they see all 4 of those practitioners on one morning. So it's a very long morning, but the concept is to try to increase collaboration, cooperation together, increase trust with the families, decrease loss to follow-up, really build a model that's clinically robust in that way. And then also use our clinical model as a way to provide wraparound services that kind of create this community of welcome and resilience. So we have some additional programs on top of this clinical model. I think Natalie, you can take those.
Sure. So we've been trying to always think outside of the box and really connect with the family. So one of the ideas that we've been incorporating now for its 5th round is called La Monarca. It's a support group for youth and their caregivers. We meet across a 10-week series, and we teach kids coping skills to help reduce those depressive anxiety and trauma symptoms. We spend some time talking about acculturative stress, validating those experiences, migratory grief, and really strengthen sort of their cultural identity and who they are, and just really creating a sense of community, because we know that's one of the buffers that can help with those mental health challenges, that connection with other people, and not feeling so alone. So La Monarca has been really wonderful. We've also had these talleres de bienestar in partnership with the Mexican consulate. Dr. Naranjo, who is here with us today in the audience, helped us out with this program, but really just offering other outlets to provide education to the families, to the community. These were completely free and available through Zoom and a Facebook Live. So really trying to meet families where they're at and share information across all of these different topics. This summer we had a soccer team as well that we formed. There were some quirks to the process, but we hope to bring it back in the near future as well. But really trying to just think outside of the box and meet the community where they're at.
And then the last thing I just want to share, and I'll give it back to Sebastian, and at least I'll be able to stay around for a few questions if people want to ask them. Because we're dealing with a group of primarily or almost exclusively of pediatricians, I like to show this map. So the point is to emphasize really like the privilege that we have as pediatricians to practice, to try to do this kind of work in the state of California. Because the dark green states on here, of which California is one, are states where children have access to healthcare through CHIP or through our state's Medicaid, regardless of their immigration status. So that is far from the truth throughout the entire country, but here in California, it is the case. So our kids, and a lot of times our case management starts when the family is still in Texas or the family is still in New York. the same day that they arrive in California, we can get them into a primary care visit, and then even in some cases we can get them into a subspecialty visit at CHLA due to medical acuity, and they can at least theoretically get the same level of care as that affluent kid who's a born citizen in the United States. So it's a great privilege. It makes work easier to be in California. And it's up to us to close that gap between that theoretical, that concept that all of the kids get equal care, and the reality of what these families actually face when they arrive, even in a place like California. Okay, so I'll stop and turn it over and stop sharing.
Yeah, in the meantime, everyone, thank you for your questions in the chat. A couple of those questions I think were addressed kind of throughout the presentation, but one that Dr. Delgado was able to bring up was a question around kind of sponsorship and if the qualifications around being a sponsor have changed at all, because there might be times in which a family member might not be able to be an official sponsor, and if anybody can speak to that.
Yeah, I'll say a little bit about that, and then I don't know, Gene, if you have a take on it too. I mean, I don't think the official policy has changed very much about it. I think there have been some significant functional changes in how that process goes on, which, you know, some of you guys know I briefly worked at a ORR facility that was here in the Los Angeles area. I think there's a big substantive change that occurred between the Trump administration and the Biden administration, which is that people, if you remember back during the Trump years, a lot of families rightly, as it turned out, believed that by giving their information to the government in order to be a sponsor, that information would be used against them, and that adult family members of the incarcerated child would be placed into their own removal proceedings or deportation process because of raising their hand to take care of the child in need. And I think FOIA requests, Freedom of Information Act requests, demonstrated that that actually was the case, that they were being targeted in that way under the previous administration. So that has changed. I think to answer the question, like, are there family members who can't be sponsors? Definitely. There's many family members for different kids who, like, they don't come forward, or they have trepidation about coming forward because of these reasons. Some people can't pass a background check. Some people can't prove that familial relationship to the child. So it can be difficult. And they, you know, for a lot of kids, the government goes through many, many different possibilities before they find a sponsor that they can actually place the kid with.
And I would just add, there's logistical. So I agree with Dr. Harlow. The Trump administration was arresting certain parents who were not in lawful status, who came to be reunited with their children. And so there was trepidation there to do that. But another thing is just logistical. If the parent has to go to Texas or Arizona or wherever the child is to pick them up, if they take a southern route, you know, if they don't have driver's license, if they are going through checkpoints, that's a risk that they're going to take. They may not have the identification to fly. And so that has been a barrier. I know under certain administrations, including the Biden administration, there will be caseworkers who will fly the children out to California, for example, and do reuniting. But that is just kind of another thing, is just the risk of travel for people who are undocumented to go to the site to pick up their children is sometimes an issue.
Great. Well, I thank everyone who's, you know, logged on to this webinar for being able to sit with us and be able to learn about kind of these three topics and the effort that we have at and that we're lucky to be able to have as the kids in Los Angeles. If anybody does have any more questions they want to put into the chat or stay and voice out loud, a couple of us will stay for a few minutes. But thank you guys so much for coming.
Thanks for the great presentation. Just a quick question. This is Tomas. I'm on the phone. How do you guys get your funding, and how do you ensure your sustainability to make sure that you can continue doing this amazing work?
Well, that is a complicated, ongoing crisis of my life that Natalie has been seeing unfold, the recent iteration of it. It's basically from a lot of different sources. So we started a little over 5 years ago. Very, very small with totally no funding whatsoever, and formal kind of collaboration with Dr. Cruz and I, with a handful of patients, and we kind of grew over time. We've had private giving support for what we've done. We've had institutional support. We have one grant from the federal government currently. We're trying to get another one. So funding sources in a lot of different ways. We've depended on, honestly, the free labor of essentially everyone involved in the project in some capacity has done a lot of uncompensated work at different times. But it's an ongoing process. But I think that's probably the mix, is like grants, private giving, institutional support, none of them being very rock solid in our experience, but by having kind of like a diversity of funding mechanisms, we can keep it going over time. You want to add anything to that, Natalie or Jean?
I mean, I agree with exactly what you said, Dr. Harlow, and I will add in that, because CHLA is also a training hospital, I think we have a lot of students that rotate their time with us too, and that gives us a lot of support to be able to see more youth and families. So we've connected with USC School of Social Work, and we have students rotate through us every year. Some of our psychology fellows within the Behavioral Health Institute's training program, they rotate through us through a separate GPE grant that funds their time. So yeah, it's just a puzzle piece with multiple aspects to it.
Great. If there's no more questions, then we'll give you guys back your evening. Thank you guys, everyone, so much.